So the title of this paper has changed a little bit since my overly maybe expansive abstract that's in the program, rather than global music, history, and studies.
Keeps going
I
back.
did it again?
Don't touch the computer anymore.
I can't touch it?
No.
That won't work.
Can you close those other desktops?
Possibly. Why was it not doing this before? Let's try again. Let me try this. Take that. All right. Still there? Wonderful.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Zoom people, are you seeing this?
We can't.
Oh, we can't hear that. We can't hear you, but yeah. Okay, cool. Let's assume that that you are. It says it's sharing. So the title of this presentation has changed slightly. I will be focusing entirely on the idea of the global ethnomusicology, microhistory, and the beneath of non-Western music. Coming to London, I had Stuart Hall on the mind, as I sometimes do, and so his 1993 essay, "What is this Black in Black popular culture?" was very much in my mind, with its live dialectical thinking that provided a model that helped animate the thoughts with which I'll end about the political repercussions of global music history studies as a disciplinary formation, perhaps, in the academy. So I want to play a little bit of the music that I study, in part because I came to this project ethnographically, as I'll say, but also because this is a group, as we're thinking about history, that brings together young and older musicians, not only to rehearse, but also to engage in excursions to learn and arrange music from local elders in nearby river communities. I like this particular group because the group is amazing, as you're about to see, but also because the leader, Wisman Tenorio, begins the song with a lengthy history lesson about the region. I'll jump around a little bit, but you will get the idea. Oh, and also because this is for an audience also of other young musicians, right? So I think that the intergenerational nature of it sort of reflects the historical aspects of what I'm interested in looking at in part.
El bambuco viejo hacen sus orígenes con la llegada de nuestros antepasados a estas tierras de los indígenas.
Talking about the arrival of Africans,
Llegado y traído
I won't translate the whole
por
thing.
estos españoles.
I arrived at the past as an ethnographer. In my research about the music of the Black people of the southern Pacific coast of Colombia, I found myself trying to find in the past ways to deepen my understanding of what people meant when they talked about the ancestors, or when they talked about the city or the country or Blackness itself. From the ethnographic present, I found myself looking back to the 1990s and the 1950s and the 1880s, and the next thing I knew, I was deep into the 18th century. That context of colonial enslavement. Ultimately, my monograph was structured historically, and as its subtitle indicates, a genealogy of musical meaning in Colombia's Black Pacific, profoundly concerned with questions of historicity. So that's what I was working on at the beginning of my slow approach to global music history studies, which, as it turns out, was at that same moment, pretty much beyond my even peripheral vision, was starting to come together. Being involved in the 2019 Atlantic Crossings Conference that my colleague Victor Coelho and PhD candidate Brian Barone put on in 2019, working with Brian and his fellow BU PhD candidate Rachel Carpentier, and being brought onto panels by Gabriel Solis and Daniel Castro Pantoja, sort of allowed me to start entering into understanding this field. Although I have to confess to you that I still feel like a bit of a dilettante. One of the reasons why I thought it was a good idea to do this conference is so I could kind of tap your collective brains. But I do feel like I'm starting to be able to have things to say about the idea of global music history. But let's turn to our question: what is the global in this global music history? As a number of scholars note, the figure of the global in global music history is ambiguous, either a worldwide account of the history of all music, or the historical study of each of the world's many musics, a global history of music, or a history or histories of global musics. This is very much David's formulation. The ambiguity between the two mirrors in some ways the subdisciplinary divide, I would say, between musicology and contemporary ethnomusicology. And I say this, and I'm interested in this because, in part, I do think that we at least should be coming to a point in which there's some sort of disciplinary convergence. So maybe what I'm thinking about here as I kind of plumb my own thoughts about this is, what is the role of the former ethnomusicology after the revolution, right? When we have this kind of new sort of formulation, this heterogeneous, dynamic, kind of weirdo formulation that's going to come together out of this. I'm struck by the ways in which the discussion of the debate mirrors the sort of subdisciplinary divide. It is often musicologists who are more interested in a global history of music, which for the past half century, ethnomusicologists have tended towards studies narrowly framed on specific, even if geographically dispersed, groups or musical forms, usually set, as we were reminded by Michael, in the ethnographic present. That is to say, in some ways, neither global nor historical in scope. Thus, although Olivia Blokel, who's here, who is a musicologist, of course, phrases a collection of historical case studies of, quote, the musical past of discrete regions, written mostly by ethnomusicologists, she laments that it has, quote, the unfortunate consequence that it tends to address the global scale through the assemblage of microhistories, end quote. Treating history only through dynamics internal to the group in question, and thus failing to theorize on the larger scale dynamics necessary for a global history of music. Lest it seem that I am speaking from disciplinary defensiveness as an ethnomusicologist, I have to say, I think she's right. There is a kind of suspicious coherence, a kind of hermeticism to the way in which ethnomusicologists delimit their objects of study, which tend to be defined around a specific genre or a specific group of people or a specific instrument, and that object of study remains intact even as it undergoes globalization or preservation or hybridization or professionalization or secularization or migration or whatever the process in question is. But while the music or the group of people that practice it are described as undergoing change, they nonetheless maintain a kind of object-like continuity through historical time. Even ethnomusicological theories of globalization, and I have a lot of beef with the way that we could talk about that. We could talk about the 90s, but I don't want to do it because I'll go off on a tangent. We maybe do that in the question and answer. Even though ethnomusicological theories of globalization, in their questioning of the relationship between the global and the local, have tended, even in theorizing hybridity between the two, that is between global and local, they've tended to reify both categories, global and local, as if they existed in the world antecedent to their entanglement. This is strikingly different from the porosity and internal contradiction that characterizes musicologists' approach to global music history. I'm thinking in particular of David Irving's call to go beneath Western music, to seek both, quote, hidden hybridities from beyond the West that helped construct Western musical forms and their underlying philosophies, and crucially, their naturalization, the naturalization within the construct of Western music that obscures the process, often colonial, by which they were incorporated in the first place. This contrast between the Teflon-coated imperviousness of most ethnomusicological musics of study, including historical ethnomusicology, and the porous, even self-alienating version of Western music beginning to emerge in musicological approaches to global music history is all the more striking given that both ethnomusicology and musicology have tended to focus on singular, distinctive music repertoires. In doing so, however, they seem to be drifting in opposite directions. As ethnomusicologists, reacting in the 1970s or so to the racist evolutionary narratives of comparativism, as Martin Stokes reminds us, as ethnomusicologists tightened their focus to synchronic case studies as a reaction to comparativism, musicologists, reacting to the racism lurking in the repertoire's claims to universality, have increasingly moved toward more permeable, even reticulated conceptions of Western music. The entrenchment, this is just nice pictures of stuff, so you don't have to think about me, but we are going to be visiting Nobita in 1744 in a moment. The entrenchment and pervasiveness of commonplace assumptions about the nature of Blackness in music, I would say, is so deeply set as to be practically ideological, certainly within music studies. So when I first began writing about the music of Black people in Colombia, I realized that it would be helpful to try and understand it without the assumptions that I had, presentist, US-focused, even within the kind of homogenized structure of this idea of the Afro-Latin American. In order to understand without those assumptions, the only way I could think to not borrow from commonplace notions of Blackness in the music of the United States and the Caribbean was not to assume Blackness as a self-evident category, but to start following the people and the practice to see how Blackness emerged as a descriptor and what kind of work it did. As I explain in the book, there are particular moments in which Blackness emerges in the micropolitics of daily life, in the political struggle of the people of the Pacific, and in other registers. But I found it particularly useful to see how Blackness waxed and waned as a salient category for describing the people phenotypically Black of the Pacific, who called themselves not Black, but libres, free people, or renacientes, the new sprouts. What I found by moving backward to the 18th century was that many of the categories that seemed self-evident were in fact conspicuously unformed and unpresupposed. From trying to avoid presentist ideological assumptions about the nature of Blackness and Black music, the project shifted to a study of the construction of Blackness as a category, a process in which, as I was to find, music played a significant part. I will not argue again what I wrote in the chapter 2 of my book, but also that I presented on in the Atlantic Crossings conference. But I'll give you a summary. I argued that Black Pacific marimba music is a local adaptation of 6/8 dance forms that were widely distributed through different sectors, social sectors of the Iberian world, but sufficiently impacted by African forms of music making, whether by African, Black Iberian, or Ibero-American musicians, that this 6/8 form was easily adopted into the musical logic of Africans and their descendants in the Southern Pacific as they continued to arrive. My approach to doing that was to look at different kinds of social affiliation that enslaved people would have had, as members of ethno-linguistic groups, as a category of enslaved people in the colonial context, as families, perhaps to the extent that families could exist, and as members of enslaved work gangs, in order to see what kind of affiliations and musical languages they would have had in common that would have made possible the very act of making music together. So I looked closely at the instruments described in colonial accounts, and compared that with the likely provenance of the instruments with which enslaved people arriving in Colombia may have been familiar, and with an eye to the polities, trade zones, and the kinds of cultural contact, the ecumenes, an idea I find very useful, that would have made sense at a level that was neither too granular nor that imagined Africa too monolithically, that I borrowed from my colleague at Boston University, the historian John Thornton. Comparisons where the historical record couldn't give me the clues that I need, I was able to make comparisons with demographically similar settings. I found that Jamaican coffee plantations in the 1780s seemed to be a good point of comparison for a number of different reasons. One of them was that Jamaicans apparently were engaging in a sort of set dance sort of process in which different African nations, quote unquote, dances would be performed one after the other, often with a trio genre like a jig at the end. The fact that I was able to find in the record the simultaneity of instruments of different provenances in Colombia suggests to me that this may have been a similar sort of practice that was happening in present-day Colombia and Ecuador. I also looked at the everyday music making in different contexts in the colonial Pacific. For that, I found useful the book, The Dream of the Hanged Man, by the historian Iván Espinosa, an account of the town of Novita, a slim work deeply inspired by Carlos Ginzburg's seminal microhistory, The Cheese and the Worms. Reconstructed from court records, it describes a typical Saturday evening, September 4th, 1773, in Novita, where white commoners and nobles, many of them traders from the distant Cauca Valley or Bogota, and enslaved and free people of all colors gathered in the town's boarding houses, some of which doubled as gambling parlors. This helped me understand interracial and interclass music making in a way that allowed me to see the types of convivialities, or at least the types of musical languages in common that were emerging, even though always inflected by the profoundly hierarchized nature of that society. This and other sources in turn allowed me to think through not only a more complex understanding of the effects of this 6/8 complex of music as a non-racially coded, widely spread set of forms played in different instrumentations, but also the way in which particular instruments, like the definitively African marimba, first become deracialized as they're taken up by indigenous and mestizo groups, and then re-Africanized at particular moments in history. But while the libres, the renacientes, constructed their own essentially maroon society, living on the fringes of the mainstream of the Colombian nation through the 19th century, it was ultimately, as I would write in chapter 3, the 20th century, when contact with Black people from the broader Atlantic, and Black culture and Black music, I should say, from the broader Black Atlantic, that local self-understandings began to take on some of the characteristics of more globally regnant notions of Blackness. In making this argument, I found myself in this beneath that David talks about. Not the beneath of Western music, but of Colombian Pacific music, which had turned out not to be a musical form that developed and emerged and moved around by itself, but rather was itself the sounded convergence of a million streams. This is not the global from the local point of view. The difference here is the permeability. The difference here is the foundational globality of the local, if we want to use those terms of global and local. In this way, I started to realize that I was amassing not an account of global connections, which is something that the historical musicology side of global music history has focused very much on, this sense of the connections. And I think it's important to also apply a bit of interpretive pressure on the, here we have this person from this place, here in this place doing this other thing, right? Rather, sorry, I lost my place. So rather than an account of global connections in order to make an argument about hybridity, I found I was making an argument that looked beneath the set of understandings of the world that was presumed to hybridize. So in that sense, I think that there are, this is just, so if we look, for example, at this foundational 16th century moment of the presentation of the leaders of this maroon community who have half conquered and half married into an indigenous kingdom in on the Pacific coast of present-day northwestern Ecuador, as they present themselves to the oidor, to the sort of mini regent, the authorities, to the king, we can already see that from the origins, all of this story is already totally entangled, right? The beneath is already there. This started to make more sense to me as I looked for this in, for example, the work of some ethnomusicologists, some rather unexpected, like here's Gerhard Kubik, of all people, talking about the idea that, quote, the very word hybrid borrowed from genetics loses its qualifying capacity from the moment one realizes that all cultures have never been anything else. This is the beneath. It reminds me too of the notion of cosmopolitanism put forward by Sheldon Pollock et al., public culture people with long names, which essentially suggests that cosmopolitanism is not an active process of hybridity, right? But rather it's a way of understanding without the types of purifications that have been imposed through ideas like nationalism. This suggests with Ana Maria Ochoa, in what I think is a very important and underread article of hers, that what we need to be looking at in a certain way is the work of invisibilization, in which tradition appears as natural and hybridity as constructed. That is to say, hybridity is the way of the world. The purification of things as being isolated is actually where the ideological work, what the ideological work goes into. She borrows this idea from Bauman and Briggs in Voices of Modernity, who made the suggestion and actually set me on the path of conceiving the book in this way. It's not the ontological status of supposedly pure forms that interests us here, but rather the epistemological work of purification. This is a Latourian language, of course. So I want to return to Blokel's, Olivia's, critique of the failure of the assemblage of microstudies to address the global scale. And she makes this critique in two ways. Number one, she says we are, or ethnomusicologists, or these ethnomusicologists are treating history only through dynamics internal to the group in question. I think she is absolutely right on that score. I think that is a big mistake. But she says that they're thus failing to theorize on the larger scale dynamics necessary for a global history of music. And I would say that perhaps not necessarily, right? I think that the lack of theorization about the global is maybe a place where it's useful to think through some of what's been discussed in the discipline of history, which is the relationship between micro and macro history. And this is the last point. I'm coming to the end here. I'm thinking of an essay from 1993 in which Carlo Ginzburg, the famous writer of the microhistory of the cheese and the worms that I mentioned before, sort of describes what he was trying to do. One thing that I'm sorry, not about this particular essay, but one thing that I think is important is that while microhistory certainly has its gaps, it's important to recognize that macrohistory does too. After all, if we think through Braudel's sweeping work, right? He only deals with Europe and Asia because those are the only places that he can get statistics that are significantly abstracted to allow him to make the broad, narrative that he does. So what Ginsburg says is that it's very difficult to try and figure out a reconciliation between micro and macro history, right? Micro history seems to look at the tiniest sort of scale, right? While macro history, using a sort of visual art or cinematic metaphor, is this huge sweep out, right? He shows the, he talks about these different paintings of great battles and so on, or we can think of like Bruegel paintings or Bosch or something like that, all these little figures like doing all this stuff, right? He says one way in which people have tried to do this, and I think this is probably what I have tried to do, is to move back and forth between scales. The problem with this, however, so there's like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can see the small, you can't see the big, you can't see the both at the same time, right? He says that this becomes very disjunctive, and what it ends up doing is sort of changing the way in which we imagine time. And he suggests something that he tried to do in his microhistory, which I think is very interesting, which is that he compares his own attentions to the paintings of the futurist painter Umberto Boccioni. I'll show you the pictures in a second, featuring a woman on a balcony in which the street comes into the painting. And the reason why I think that this is an interesting example is that necessarily, in order to move back and forth between the street and the balcony, right, in ways that I think also are like really powerful for kind of the personal and the political and the public and the private. And there's I think a really interesting sort of feminist angle in a present day reading of this, that it necessitates a certain kind of experimentalism in the way that we're writing our narratives, right? That is not something I have done. That is something I am afraid to do. But I wonder what it's going to look like is as we move closer to perhaps approaches that are more indebted to a kind of humanities approach to doing what we do. That said, I also want to underline that after the revolution, all of us ethnomusicologists will be, what do they say about the coal miners in Appalachia? They'll all be coding. So all of the ethnomusicologists after the Green Revolution or the global history post-disciplinary revolution, I think that we have the tools to be able to do this type of microhistory, because I think that by looking at this close sort of way that we just saw in Michael's presentation, we can sort of open up this sort of beneath that allows not the global connections that are happening as these fixed objects move through space and time, but rather to look at their being constituted out of these networks and out of these sorts of complexities. So that's what I got. Thanks so much for your time.
Question for Michael? Nikki, or sorry.
I have kind of one, yeah. Thank you. I really love that. It's really exciting. And I love the whole thing you discussed about purification and hybrids, and it's wonderful. I guess the thing I was thinking too, in terms of that kind of last part, was about like, I would think of how rarely we take account. I think in general, not in our field, I think in general, that there is the case that you can scale things up so much they become different things.
Yeah.
You know, like I think we so rarely take account of that. So I was thinking how, like the example you used of how that changes time scale is kind of like vertigo inducing. It's like, it's a little different than the way I was thinking of it. It's productive. So I guess I'm just curious what ways of narrating that you imagine. You said you're kind of scared to, but you must have ideas or things must occur to you or something.
I've been thinking a lot about film, as I think I've said to a couple of you, but for exactly the opposite reason, right? The thing about film is that it allows us to sort of sit with music over time, right? And so one of the things that we don't do very often, we'll do the snip. I mean, I did a snippet, we all do snippets. I mean, but this isn't something, or what Julia played, right? I mean, how long does the whole sort of thing take? You're there and you're in for the duration, right? So film is very good, I think, or could be very good for sort of sitting with things and undergoing the time experience that we frankly never do because we're so much more concerned with the sound than the time. When I think music is a technology of time as much as a technology of sound, right? How we would be able to do that in thinking about sort of the broader sweeps is in some ways about learning from other people's narratives and how they go about doing that. So actually the type of narratives that Michael's talking about, I think are really useful, right? But narratives are also sort of sat through, right? And music itself, for example, in what you're talking about, right, are also ways of retelling histories that are narratives that take place in their own time, but also are extended out to this broader set of time. What are Georgina Bourne has her 4 planes of mediation or something, and one of them is like the right there doing the thing, right? And the other one is sort of broad social, right? I think that can also work as a way to sort of talk about and to sort of superimpose these different levels, these different sort of cycles of time on top of each other in a way that mirror the sort of weird sort of perspectivalism or like exploded perspectivalism that we have in the Boccioni painting that Ginsberg does as well. Yeah. So
Question on Zoom. You have a question from Mickey.
No, mine's like-
Are you sure?
you sure?
So you have a question on Zoom then?
Great.
Michael?
Oh wait, can I hear you? Can you? Could someone speak? Wait, did I?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead and ask your question. I think Michael's ready.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Am I the, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't tell it was my name that you were saying, forgive me.
Michael's ready. For
No,
questions.
it's, you know, all these ideas are so important and ways to think about it. And it's just a question that's been bugging me actually since it was posed. So this isn't my question actually, but it's something that's been bothering me since a colleague of mine at William & Mary, who's no longer with us, Olu Domini, now not with us at William & Mary, he's still alive. Olunaike, who's a scholar of Nigerian, essentially, religion, right? And he asked me how to get away, when we think about global history, how do we get away from the Western conception of time, right? So the idea, sort of as you pulling from what you said, the sort of lack of theorization of the global and getting underneath or beneath rather the set of understandings. How do we get underneath the understanding of time as sequential and consequential, to sort of quote Solons, but sort of these events that happen, right? How do we tell the global history of music without always relying on Western history as our reference point, right? Rather than cyclical time or other sorts of understandings of history.
Yeah, that's a fantastic and very difficult question. Thanks for that, Michael. You know, in some ways, thinking about the place of microhistory is that at least it gives us something like a view, not a view of globality as if it's, you know, the sort of blind man in the element parable, but rather globality, the global history, like as it happens in a place, which in some ways is everything that matters, at least in that place, right? But I think it's much more difficult to do that in terms of an experience of time. I hope that there are ways to think through, you know, as I was saying, sort of ways of getting across narrative. But one of them I think that's really important, as I was just saying, is that in different sort of settings, people have their own ways of narrativizing that, again, are not only important for the content that they have, the way that they tell the narrative, but rather the way in which the narrative itself is structured in time, right? Whether it's musical, whether it's sort of storytelling, whether it's theater, all of these different sorts of ways. You know, and so I don't know exactly how we approach those, but again, I'm thinking that sort of things like film and different sorts of media work may be more successful than writing in doing that. Now, that said, all of this is happening in the academy. People are trying to get tenure, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what you do after you have tenure. Is you're, oh, how, you know, maybe I'll make a movie, right? So, you know, I want to recognize the sort of material realities that are, sorry. She just made a movie. So, so yeah, I mean, in some ways, the question is a question not only of like, what will it look like, but also like in a very sort of specific material way, how do we actually go about doing it in the sort of professional niche that we are in? Okay, Mickey, you didn't want to ask? Okay. About the what?
The beef of the 90s.
Yeah, we should do that at drinks.
Yeah.
We'll get a lot of time to do it.
Yeah, get some more drinks in me, it'll be better.
I just want to bring a really quick point, which is, I'm not sure if you're aware of what's called in the Indian Ocean, the bailosphere, which is basically this tradition of 6/8 time that comes through Portuguese Iberian dance music. And in, for instance, the Kafir, the African slave, the Indian Ocean slave trade in Colombo, has created this like total, I mean, a biosphere, all based on that movement. And so if it's generated from Africa, but from a different place, from Zanj, the East Coast, or maybe from Mozambique, it's an interesting thing to think about, because they're not connected necessarily, except by the particularities of Iberian dance music. And it is a way to do a global, but a global that does not require, both areas to know of each other's music, and yet it is a commonality that is significant. So it might be interesting. I'm happy to put you in touch with, I think it's Mahesh Radhakrishnan and Ananya Kabir's articles on this, because it might be interesting to have you guys speak across, these different
The 6-8
spaces, right?
Yeah, the 6-8 scape. Sorry, just briefly. The reason that I first encountered David's book was in part because I did a review and they pay you in books, and I was like, Philippines, okay. I want to see. I know they have 6-8 music there. What's the deal, right? What's the deal with Latin America in Asia, or an Asian place that's been colonized by as a Latin Americanist, right? And I found all the David stuff. But what I theorize in the book is essentially that this 6-8 sort of matrix kind of emerges through these colonial through these colonial types of interactions, as places like Lisbon and Seville in particular, but also places in Italy become increasingly populated by this kind of a black lumpen proletariat. There's like all of these like dudes hanging around with guitars, and there's all these sort of like kind of preoccupations about Morisco music and all of these different things. And what is it that happens during this period of time? It's 6-8. So in some ways, what that means to me is that this 6-8 became a kind of lingua franca as 200 and 300 or 100 and 200 years later, Africans were arriving into this system, right, in which that was sort of the music that was the popular music, and that sort of 3 against 4, 3 against 2 sort of made enough musical sense that people could sort of work with it, right? So that's the idea. I have no idea about the Indian Ocean history of that, but that's super interesting. I'd like to find out more. So yeah, please do.
We should probably
Yeah.
move on, right, for time. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.